About Jeff Sessions. Moving on, though, the removal of acting Attorney General Sally Yates has some Democrats crying deja vu. Lawmakers on the left say President Trump's actions last night remind them of a Saturday night back in 1973 when President Nixon purged DOJ officials. But this isn't quite the same. Back then, Nixon fired the special prosecutor who was investigating the Watergate scandal. Archibald Cox had conducted a detailed investigation into the Nixon White House and found the president was guilty of many abuses of power. Soon after that, Cox was released. Nixon's attorney general and deputy attorney general resigned in protest. The series of resignations became known as the Saturday Night Massacre.
We had a Monday night massacre. Sally Yates, a person of great integrity who follows the law, was fired by the president. She was fired because she would not pursue the executive order on the belief that it was illegal, perhaps unconstitutional.
You see it right there, Senator Chuck Schumer calling it a Monday night massacre. Joining me now from Los Angeles is former White House counselor to President Nixon, John Dean. John, there is literally nobody in the world who is better to talk about this than you, at the moment, at the very least.
Thank you, Katie.
Do you feel like the Democrats are posturing here, using this to their advantage? Can you say that this is anything like what happened back in 1973?
Well, as you made clear, it really isn't the same. It's very Nixonian in style, but not an exact parallel in situations. So there is something to draw on. In fact, the whole rollout has been so bungled, which is very contrary to Richard Nixon, who had a very smooth-running White House from day one. So there is a big difference there. But what is Nixonian is the press release they issued at the time that they fired Mrs. Yates. I've not seen such a nasty press release. They talk about betraying the Department of Justice. They talk about her being weak on borders and weak on immigration. I mean, it's a pretty nasty document, and you typically don't see that sort of thing come out of the White House. Now, Nixon might have thought those thoughts, but he was always checked by his staff before they got out.
So, in your experience, I mean, obviously it's been quite a while since Nixon was the president. We've had ups and downs in terms of rhetoric. This is certainly a new level of rhetoric, a new low, some might say. What we saw during the campaign, the transition, and now what we are seeing during the presidency, that's what a lot of people would argue. What do you believe are the risks here if we continue down this path where people are not only fired, but they're fired by saying that they are betraying the president and that they need to get in line? What is the logical conclusion to that?
Well, we have a similarity between Nixon and Trump in the fact that they're both authoritarian personalities. Nixon really, but for the tapes and people who were in the White House and understanding that personality, his authoritarianism wasn't well known. It certainly became known after the tapes were released. Trump has been right out front. He's not tried to in any way be anything other than who he is. And so these are very authoritarian-style presidencies. And we're watching what authoritarians do. They fire people. They don't want to have anybody disagree with them. They are narcissistic, and they want to draw a lot of attention to themselves. Nixon made a big deal out of the announcement of his Supreme Court justices, big shows in the East Room, what have you. The parallels are pretty scary for me as somebody who's been there.
Well, who ultimately, if those inside the White House are not going to be doing this in his inner circle, who ultimately can influence Donald Trump or wield any, I don't want to say power, but wield any influence, really, over how he comports himself, how he represents the office of the presidency, and how he goes about at least showing that he's respecting the democratic institutions that have been in place long before him and should be in place after he eventually leaves 4 or 8 years from now.
Right. From my view, from the inside, from a couple of places. First of all, the Congress can have an influence. Public opinion certainly has an influence. The family can have an influence. Those are, I think, the three principal areas that you see a person who is a strong personality gets influenced by how he conducts himself as president. It's hard for the staff. Nixon did actually, though, solicit staff advice on how he was dealing with situations, hired people to tell him how to look best and handle things best, had somebody tell him he should never wear a white shirt because it was too stark, the comparison with his shadow on his face. He said, presidents don't wear blue shirts, we only wear white shirts. So Nixon did take advice, but typically did his own thing, too.
John Dean, I hope we can bring you back for your expertise a lot during this next 4 years. I'm going to hold you to that if that's okay. Thank you so much for being with us. And that brings us to today's Microsoft Pulse question. Do you think former acting Attorney General Sally Yates was right to defy President Trump's immigration